Welcome back, everyone. Last time we left off looking at the resurrection from the perspective of Mark and Luke. Now, if we turn over to the Gospel of John in John chapter 20, we fill in more information. John chapter 20 and verse 1. Turn there with me. John chapter 20, verse 1. In verse 1, it says this. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Well, we learned that there were 3 women in Mark, more than 3 in Luke, but John focuses on Mary Magdalene, right? She is the key figure among the group of women. And she saw that the tomb had been removed from the entrance. Or sorry, that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Verse 2, so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciples, right? The one Jesus loved, right? That would be John, right? The author of the Gospel of John, and said to them, right, out of breath because she's been running, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they had put him. Verse 3, and so Peter and the other disciple, right, that being John, started for the tomb and both were running. Now, remember in Luke, we learned that Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Well, in John, the Apostle John tells us that I was with him and we were both running as fast as we could go. And somebody has stolen the body, right? And both were running. But it says this, the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now I find that just hilarious, right? That John has to tell us that I beat him to the tomb, right? It's interesting, right? When you look at the 12 disciples, right? All 12 disciples, like later the apostles, all of them are roughly the same age as Jesus, right? They're all contemporaries of Jesus, right? If Jesus is 33 years old when he's crucified, buried, and raised, the others are around 33 years old also, right? They're around 30. Matthew is the exception, right? He seems to be older, right? Matthew is a tax collector. He has an established business and he is rather wealthy. And most scholars picture Matthew being in his mid-40s. But the others are clearly 30-year-old guys, with the other exception being John and his brother James, right? They seem to be much younger. Right? And Jesus, when you look through scriptures, Jesus treats John almost like a little brother, right? He puts his arm around John. And remember at the Last Supper, John is seated next to Jesus and John puts his head on Jesus' shoulder and falls asleep, right? A 30-year-old guy does not do that, but a little brother does. Right? Jesus treats John in that way. And so we find that John outruns Peter on the way to the tomb, and John just has to point that out. I find that pretty funny, personally. Now, verse 5, it says, he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. And so John bends down, he looks in the tomb, and he sees the strips of linen, but he doesn't go in the tomb. Now at this point, let me describe to you what the tomb would look like. Now, when you go to Jerusalem, you go on one of these tours of Jerusalem, right? One of the places you visit oftentimes is this place called the Garden Tomb. Now, the Garden Tomb is most certainly not Jesus' tomb, though some have tried to speculate that, but it's not Jesus' tomb. It is about 100 years later in time. But it is a very good visual aid to what that tomb would look like. Now, in front of the tomb, there is a doorway that is about 4.5 feet high. And so you have to bend over to go into it, right? It's carved in the limestone mountainside, right? And there's a room carved into this rock. Now, in front of the doorway is this, we talked about this before, a channel carved into the rock that's about 12 inches wide. And it's kind of on a slant. It's on a hill so that the channel is where you would roll the stone down the ramp to open the tomb, and you would roll it up the ramp where it would lock in place at the top to seal the tomb. And so the stone would be at least 4.5 feet high, if not bigger, and it would be roughly a foot thick. Right? Think about a big millstone, if you will. Right? It would weigh a couple 100 pounds, if not more. And so it's very, very heavy. Now, when you bend over and look in the tomb, you see one room that's about 15 foot square. And that room that you would enter is called the weeping chamber, right? And that's where the people would go to mourn. Right, and it was typical it was a typical standard practice Judaism, right? In Jesus' day, and really even today, that when a loved one died, there is this 1 year mourning period, right? If you have a Jewish family where the husband or the wife or the child dies, after our synagogue services on Friday evening, candles are lit for those who have died, and the family stays after the service and prays for those who have died. And that happens every week after services for a 1 year period, right? In a very traditional Jewish home, the widow would wear black for an entire year. But at the end of that 1 year period, right, that period of mourning is over. Now remember, when Jesus is buried in that tomb, he is there to decompose, right? After a year, the wrappings will be taken off and the bones will be placed in an ossuary, and that ossuary would go into the family tomb. And so people would come every week, and here with the women, they come early Sunday morning to re-anoint the body, and that would happen periodically throughout the year. And why would they do that? They would anoint the body. They would wrap it in fresh linens to absorb the bodily fluids and to assist in the decomposition of the body. And so the women would go, right, and other friends would go, certainly weekly, and they would enter the tomb, into the weeping chamber, where they would pray and they would care for the body during that 1 year period. Now, as you are in that weeping chamber, directly to the right hand side, on the far wall, there is a shelf carved into that wall that would be roughly the length of the person. It would be roughly about 6 feet long. And then there will be a shelf carved on the near side, on the left, for a second body. And so you could have two bodies being prepared at the same time. And that shelf on the right-hand side, right, if you're looking at it, right, the head would be on the left side of the shelf, and the feet would be on the right-hand side of the shelf. Now, in the garden tomb, interestingly enough, the right-hand side of that shelf, there is an additional 8 inches carved into that wall, as if the shelf was prepared for a body of a certain spec, but the body that went in there was longer than that one that it was prepared for. Now, that shelf on the right-hand side is where the body of Jesus would have been. Now remember, in all the accounts, they look over on the right, and the body is not there. Now what is there is a big pile of linen strips on the floor, but there's no body. Now that's odd, because if someone stole the body, they are certainly not going to unwrap it and steal it. And so what is going on? Well, John in John chapter 20 in verse 5, he says this. He says he bent over and looked in at the strips of linen there, but did not go in, right? John did not go in. But then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head, right? John hadn't noticed that, but Peter does, right? The cloth was still lying in its place, right? It's still lying on the shelf where Jesus laid. Right, it's separate from the linens that was on the floor. Now, that's odd also, right? If Jesus got out of his linens, right? He is wrapped like a mummy, and so he cannot first take off his head wrappings because his arms are wrapped around the side, right? He had to somehow get out of his linens first, and then take the head wraps off. And so if that's the case, then why would he neatly grab the head cloth, fold it up nicely, and lay it on that shelf? Well, verse 8, finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, right, that being John, also went inside, and he saw and believed. Now, In this chapter, John, we have this sequence of verbs that are very telling. So I want to read this passage to you again, skim through this passage again. In verse 1, it says this. It says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Saw, S-A-W, right? The Greek word here is blepo, B-L-E-P-O. And it's simply an observational fact. I saw the bottled water, right? It is a factual observance. Now, look down at verse 4. Verse 4 says this, but they were running, but the other disciples outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And he bent over and looked in, right? Looked in. It's that same Greek word, blepo. Right? He saw in, right? That is simple, factual information. He saw in. Right now, when we drop down to verse 6, then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as a cloth. He saw, right? The word there is not blepo, the word there is theoreo, right? T-H-E-O-R-E-O, which is not simple observational fact, but it is critical analysis of the fact, right? He saw in that he was analyzing the information and he's coming to a conclusion. Then in verse 8, finally the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside and he saw and believed. Right? That word translated saw is not blepo or theero, it's horeo, right? H-O-R-A-O, right? And it means to fully comprehend it, right? It's when kind of that light bulb comes on and you say, I see. And so it goes from factual observation to critical examination to full comprehension, right? Fully comprehending, right? That is a sequence that we are moving through at the empty tomb with Peter and John. Then, parenthetically, John writes in verse 9, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, verse 10, then the disciples went back to where they were staying. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying, and she wept. And she bent over, took a look into the tomb, and saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, woman, why are you crying? She said, they have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. You see, Mary, she is still under the impression that someone has stolen Jesus. Someone has stolen the body of Jesus. But verse 14, at this, she turned around and she saw Jesus stand there. Right? Saw, right, is blepo, right? A simple observational fact, right? But she did not realize that it was Jesus. Think about this. She didn't recognize him. Now that is quite odd. Right? Why would she not recognize Jesus? Right? She is very close to him. Right? She has been a disciple of his for a long time. And then she turns and he's right there in front of her, but she doesn't recognize him. Verse 15, he asks her, woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? Right? And thinking that he was the gardener, she said, sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him. And Jesus said to her, Mary, Mary. And with that one word, right, she turns towards him and cries out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Right? With that one word, she recognized him. Right? It is comprehension. But why does she recognize him then? Right? Is it something about his tone of voice? Is it some gesture that he made? Right? Did he make a movement of some kind towards her? Well, we don't know. Right? We are left to wonder. Think about this. The same thing happens in the gospel according to Luke on the road to Emmaus. Or if you look with me in Luke chapter 24, at verse 13, it says this. Luke chapter 24, verse 13. It says, now the same day, right, it's Sunday still, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Verse 15, as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. right? And Jesus joins them on this journey to Emmaus. And they are walking and they are talking, but they don't recognize him. And he asks them, what are you discussing together as you walk along? And they stood there, right, their faces downcast. Verse 18, one of them named Cleopas asked him, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? Jesus asked, what things? And they answered Jesus, about Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. And the chief priests and the rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death. And they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of the women amazed us. They went to the tomb early in the morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Well, that would be Mary Magdalene who said that, remember? Verse 24, it says, then some of our companions went to the tomb. Right? Who would that be? That would be Peter and John. And they went to the tomb and found it was just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. And he said to them, how foolish are you? And how slow to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Right? And think about this. They must have looked at him with a look that just said, what do you mean? In verse 27, Jesus tells them this. He says, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Right? Jesus went back to Genesis, then to Exodus, then Leviticus, then Numbers, then Deuteronomy. Right? The 5 books of Moses. And then Jesus takes them through all of the prophets, right? As they're walking on this 7-mile road to Emmaus. Right? This 2.5-hour walk that it would take from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Right? And Jesus taught them during that walk everything said about him from Genesis through Deuteronomy and through all the prophets. Now, wouldn't you like to be present for that conversation? Continuing verse 28, it says, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But, verse 29, they urged him strongly, stay with us, for it's nearly evening, and the day is almost over. And so he went in to stay with them. Now, did you notice this? I noticed this, that even after resurrection, Jesus never turns down a dinner invitation, right? Jesus loves to party. Jesus loves to eat with folks. Well, verse 30, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and began to give it to them. And when Jesus did that, verse 31, then their eyes were open, and they recognized him, right? Comprehension. Again, right? Was it something in his tone of voice, right? Was it the way he broke the bread? Right? Was it a gesture that he made? Right? There was something about the breaking and the blessing of the bread that triggered this recognition, right? Just as there was something in his voice saying Mary that triggered the recognition for Mary Magdalene. Then they recognized him. And then we read this at the end of verse 31. And he disappeared from their sight. Now, one could see this as he simply vanished into thin air, right? Which I guess is entirely possible, although I personally think that's a stretch, right? I simply think it meant that he finished their dinner, right? He gave thanks, right? He thanked them, and Jesus went on their way. Well, and in either case, verse 32, they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? In other words, they're saying, man, we should have seen it then, right? Just the way he talked with us and what he said and how he felt. Then, verse 33, they got up and they returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them, and assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon." Verse 35, then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them and when he had broken bread. Right? He has appeared to Peter, and now he's appeared to Cleopas and his friend. And they come back and they said, he appeared to us. Right? Mary Magdalene said that he appeared to me. And now the evidence is mounting. But what is it about Jesus that they don't recognize? Well, we're going to break right here at this video. But when we come back, we're going to pick up with Luke chapter 24 and verse 36. Stay tuned.